Okay. Let's see if we can go ahead and start our class this morning. So this is definitely a topic we will be beginning and won't be finishing today. Of course, next week, Baxter is going to be teaching during this time. So we'll definitely be picking this up.
What's his name again? Baxter.
Baxter Kruger. I think that his website is paracoesis.org. Which, if you know what paracoesis is, you know exactly where he's coming from.
Okay, for those of you.
Okay, Alan.
Yeah, so before you start class, I just had a thought, I was just gonna see if you've not said something good about it. But one of the hardest things I've encountered, I guess, since I got a little bit more cold heart, warmer heart, is whenever people are crying, it makes news me cry. When Jesus left, they were all in there smooth moving Lazarus. I mean, I feel like some of it's just commiserating to other folks. Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah. He joins in mourning with those who mourn, and I think he's mourning the moment because it's a sad moment. His friend has died. Yeah, no, I agree, and we ought to. You don't need to be afraid of a lump coming up in our throat, especially the men. You know, who kind of like, no, can't do that. That's not manly. No, bad idea, right? Culturally, perhaps promoted, but not good for us to do that. Okay, so paracoesis, the John point is that is a word which refers to the circle dance of Jewish tradition, like, you know, they and all of the circle. Yeah. And
When you do that again, I'm gonna get my video.
And the point is that word has been used to, the significance is that word has been used to talk about the Trinity, that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are this non-hierarchical, circular relationship of mutual love and of pouring out love from one into the other, the Father into the Son and the Son into the Father. And that is the Spirit. Some would say the Spirit is that flow of love back and forth between the Father and the Son. And so that word paracoesis talks about a view of the Trinity, because there's a lot of bad views of the Trinity. Like the Father is God number one, the Son is lesser God number two, and then the tail end God is, you know, there's hierarchical views. Those are not biblical, they're not theologically viable, but they're often employed.
That was the dance of
the
Trinity.
It's a word, yeah, it's a word referring to a circular dance, and that word now has been used to talk about the Trinity. So the little thing I sent out, evidently, first book was called The Parable of the Dancing God. And so his website is paracoesis. You think that's a bit of a theme that he emphasizes is the Trinity, how to understand the interrelationship of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, what all that means for us as believers. So anyway, he'll be speaking next week. But what I'm speaking about, getting us started to talk about, is the wrath of God, right? To talk about how do we understand the wrath of God? What is a good, theologically robust, responsible way to talk about the wrath of God? So first I want to start with, what does the word wrath bring up in our mind? When we hear wrath, what do we think? Anger, revenge, yeah, it's not a mild anger, it's not a myth. It's like, it's really hot, strong, ferocious anger. That's what I think about wrath, right? Anything else? Yeah, the Wrath of God, a Star Trek movie. Yeah. Any other thing that you think about?
Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
Faces melting off, all that.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. Sometimes you'll hear that, like, this is wrath of God sort of stuff, which means it's very intense idea of retribution, revenge, payback. I also think about it this way, and maybe you do, maybe you don't. To me, wrath is when all patience has like played itself out, and control is now lost. Now this is an out of control rage, right? If I feel like I've been wrathful, then I feel like I've done wrong because I didn't maintain a kind of decorum or properness. I got out of control. My anger just took over. And then I became, ragingly vehement kind of thing. That's what I think about with wrath. In other words, it's a very intense, over the top. And usually it's kind of like God was patient, God was long suffering, God was patient. Okay, now I've had it. Now it's wrath time. Like I'm done with being patient. I'm done with trying to be kind. Now you just all get burned to sin.
213 degrees.
Yeah, exactly. Crank it up. We're gonna roast everything because now we're angry. So because I'm sorry, was someone gonna? So because that's what we think about, then I think reasonably so, we have real questions when we read about the wrath of God, right? Here's how I want to approach the subject. I want to set aside for the time being the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, because if we start there, well, I don't think it's the right place to start. And if you think about it, how many examples of the wrath of God are all coming? So many come from the Old Testament, right? Korah and his sons all swallowed up by the earth. They ain't having a Abihu killed by heavenly fire. You got story after story. Some kids make fun of the prophet and bears come out and eat 42 of them. I mean, it's just like, and it's all said, this is the wrath of God, right? You ticked God off, and he just decided to visit a plague upon you, right? So a lot of our impressions come from those Old Testament passages. So I want to set those aside and I want to start with Jesus. Because I think we have to start with Jesus always. If I was printing a Bible, I would print a Bible starting with the New Testament first and the Hebrew Scriptures as an addendum. I mean, I'd make it as an appendix, right? And so you would open my Bible, page 1 would be the Gospel of Matthew, right? Because the problem is because we put it in a book form and people say, I'm going to read my Bible. Where do they start? They start in Genesis and they read for 39 books. And then they start reading about Jesus and they're trying to say, okay, what I've read in these 39 books is the honest to good truth about God. And now somehow, as I start reading about Jesus, I have to fit that in with what I've already read. And I think that's exactly the wrong way around.
Or you read 22 books and quit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you get somewhere in Leviticus, you probably get into the third book or something. You get into Leviticus, you read my Bible. Okay, so what I would do is I would say, you got the 4 Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 Gospels. I just put those right there, and then I would have a little separation, and then all the commentary on that, which is Paul and Peter and James, and and they're all writing about Jesus, the Gospels, which is the core, which is where you start. And then in an appendix, I would say, and here's the Old Testament, which can only be understood in light of what you've already read. Once you've worked your way through these books, then you can read those and you start to realize that they are metaphorically speaking of Jesus. That's why I'm going to start with Jesus. Okay? So we're going to approach the question of the wrath of God. We start with Jesus. Does Jesus show wrath? There's only really one candidate for that, one incident, right?
Yeah.
What's that?
The tape.
That temple, right? That temple, right? We got to look at the temple because everything else, I mean, he has strong words for the Pharisees, but when does he ever lose control? It's his disciples that want to call down fire on cities that reject. Jesus is not like wanting to do that. He's like, no, let's just go on to another town. We're not going to burn anybody up here, right? Jesus does not seem to lose control. He does not. I mean, he'll say straight up, "You guys are wrong." But where's the wrath? Where's the, there doesn't seem to be any.
Get behind me, Satan.
Yeah. Now, yeah, there's occasions of frustration with the disciples. Like, how long am I going to be with you? But that's not wrath, right? And get behind me, Satan, again, is straight up being honest. You have got in mind the wrong things there, Peter. And you know, you got to rethink. You're thinking about the things of man, not of God. But where's wrath? I mean, he doesn't strike Peter dead for that, right? Lions don't come out of the woods and consume Peter, right? Not the earth does not swallow up Peter, right? So there's only one candidate that I can see for Jesus having wrath, and that is the cleansing of the temple. So let's look at it. And the first place I want to look is in Mark's account. So Mark 11. Now, wrath is never used about this account. There's nothing in the scriptures that say Jesus became wrathful. We're insinuating that, right? But let's read what happens, and I think you'll see that it does not fit the definition that we started with, that we gave about what we think wrath is. So Mark chapter 11, beginning in let's begin in verse 8. So this is the triumphal entry. This is Sunday of Passion Week. Starting in verse 8, and many spread their coats in the road, and others spread leafy branches which they had cut from the field. Those who went in front and those who followed were shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest. Verse 11. Jesus entered Jerusalem and came into the temple. And after looking around at everything, he left for Bethany with the 12, since it was already late. Now, what's he going to do tomorrow? Okay, tomorrow he's going to cleanse the temple. But Mark tells us he went into the temple Sunday evening and he looked around, he saw what was going on. And he did not immediately lose control, lose his patience, and break out into a rage. What this tells me is he makes a calculated, thinks about it and chooses what to do. And one of my definitions for rage, for wrath, is this idea of the loss of control, the bursting out of anger. Jesus sees everything going on, decides now's not the time. I'm going to think about it and we'll come with a plan, right? And I'm going to do something about what's going on. So it's not a loss of control. It's not an instantaneous thing. He looks at it and he goes to Bethany, stays with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, comes back the next day and going to address what's going on in the temple. Okay? Second place I want us to look is the account from John chapter 2. Now this is odd because all the other gospels put the cleansing of the temple at the end of Jesus' ministry, basically on Monday of Passion Week. John, because John is doing what John is doing, puts it at the beginning of the ministry. That's for theological reasons, not chronological reasons. Some people will say, well, there were two cleansing of the temple. No, I don't think so. I think John knows there was a cleansing of the temple, but John is starting where the other gospels finish. He's starting with the risen Lord. That's why he begins with, in the beginning was the Word. He doesn't begin with, and there's a lady named Mary engaged to a guy named Joseph, and here's how this baby was born. No, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word, and Jesus is this Word become incarnate. And John's writing a very different gospel. And I think he chooses to put the cleansing of the temple, and this is not my idea. This idea has been taught, and I have accepted it as, I think, a good way of looking at it. John puts it at the beginning because he basically wants to start where the other gospels finish. So in the other gospels, it's at the crucifixion that the centurion says, surely this man was the Son of God. You know how many times in chapter 1 and 2 of John's gospel, people are declaring Jesus to be the King of Israel? John the Baptist says he is the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world. He's everything at the beginning of John's gospel is where the other ones finish. The conclusion of the other gospels is showing this was the Son of God. The beginning of John's gospel is this is the Son of God, and we're going to take him from that perspective right from the start, and then we're going to talk about it, right? So for that reason, I think John puts the event of the cleansing of the temple right at the beginning, because we're starting with the Jesus who cleanses the temple, right? Instead of finishing there, we're starting there. But listen to the account. This is the point. John 2, beginning in verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. And he made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers, and he overturned their tables. And to those who were selling the doves, he said, take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a place of business. His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. The Jews, which is John's way of talking about the religious leaders, the Jews then said to him, what sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things? Okay. The religious leaders respond to his actions by asking him a question. Who gave you the authority to do these? They didn't say, call the guards, arrest this madman who's run amok. And believe me, if he was running amok and creating mayhem, they would have, right? Because you remember when Paul is seized in the temple and accused of bringing in a Gentile and the crowd's getting an uproar, the Roman guards entered the temple because they were adjacent to it to always make sure that nothing went crazy. The Roman guards came in, arrested Paul on the spot because he was the center of whatever was going on, and they were going to put a stop to it. What Jesus does not create a cause for temple guards to be called. It's not mayhem and violence. I would suggest no one was whipped. People were not beaten. Animals might have been, but if you've ever tried to move oxen, sweet talking an oxen, you're probably not going to get it. It wasn't even what would go under the level of cruelty to animals. He had his whip and he started moving the animals, and he flipped some tables. You know what I think the money changers did? Hey, what are you doing? Hey, set my table back up, get my money back on it. They just set up shop within minutes. I'm sure.
Video that.
But you see what I'm saying? I think they're like, hey, what's this guy doing? And they just, he's causing a ruckus. And the leaders come up, who gave you the authority to do this? So how do the leaders perceive what he's doing? What do they know is the meaning of what he's doing? What he says he's doing. What's he doing?
Take charge.
Yeah, he's taking charge. What else is he? What's he doing?
Opposing he's in opposition to something.
He's calling them out. He's judging.
Yeah.
He's discerning. He's saying this is not what this place is about. He's rendering a judgment. Now he's not condemning people, but he's condemning actions.
Presenting truth.
Right. He's saying this is to be a house of prayer. I mean, John doesn't say that, but another gospel says, this is a house of prayer, not a place of business. You're making it this place of, another passage says, a den of thieves. It's not even honest business what you're doing. Not only is it business, it's not even honest business, right? So he's calling them out. He's making a judgment. He's passing judgment on the way the temple's being administered. And they come up and say, who gives you the authority to tell us how to run the temple? See, they don't say, bind that crazy man who's been, charging with assault and battery. He hasn't assaulted anybody. He's not harmed anyone. People are not bloodied and bruised because Jesus beat him up. Right? I'm convinced when I read the gospel accounts, this is not rage, wrath, violent kind of stuff. It's not Jesus. He came the night before. He went home, thought about it, the guest house. He came back with a plan and he made a statement. It was a prophetic statement.
You think we could get called out on the church of making money on the crucified?
We ought to wonder, we ought to critique our actions in light of that. Make sure.
Said something right. Why we didn't know what was being said, though.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I think that their reaction shows they know he's passing a prophetic judgment on things. He has not committed violence and people are not injured, or he would have been arrested. He makes a statement. Okay, Dave, you had a thought or a question?
Yeah. Like, remembering that there were times where my kids were younger, you know, they did something they shouldn't do, and I caught them doing it, and my thoughts were, I did that when I was a kid, it's you know, it's normal, you know, but I couldn't react that way with them because they had to see a reaction that, no, this is wrong, this is, you know, and so you saying they went away and thought about how, I'm sure there's more than they thought, and expressing something strong, you know, is what society, this is how they're going to go.
Made a whip while he was away.
Yeah, he formed himself a whip to drive the animals out. You got to get those big cattle moving. And he made a point.
He could have been Karen.
Greg, can you hear me?
Now think about how this is in the prophetic tradition. Can you think of I'm talking about the tradition of Old Testament prophets. Did Old Testament prophets ever make a point by doing something? Yeah, all the time, right? What are some examples of Old Testament prophets physically acting something out so as to reinforce their point?
He did some naked walking.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't that Ezekiel who like lays naked for 180 days or something? And says, you know, there's Jeremiah who carves a hole through the wall and crawls through it and says, so you will be taken out of Jerusalem, and then walks around with a yoke on his shoulders. I mean, they're always using object lessons, right? They'd be crazy prophets walking around carrying a yoke. Yeah, marrying a prostitute and say, my relationship with this unfaithful woman is a parable about God being patient with you, right? They're always enacting it.
So I just have a note here that follows up that it's the point that this is prophetic theater.
Yes.
Using that word.
Yeah, prophetic theater is exactly. It's in keeping with so many Old Testament traditions, is where you act it out. John the Baptist living in the wilderness, eating locusts and wild honey and wearing camel hair. That's prophetic theater. It's not like he had to do that. He chose to do that, to embody a kind of message. Come out of your fine houses, come out of your where you are, come out here and you know, this is a new thing. Right? It's not partaking of that. So he won't eat and drink. Jesus complains, I came eating and drinking, and you said, you know, I'm a glutton. And he came not eating and drinking, you said he has a demon. He's like, you can't satisfy you people. He enacts one form and you won't believe him. I enact the opposite and you won't believe me. But yeah, prophetic theater is the right way to put it. This is prophetic theater. Animals were not injured, people were not bloody. This is not rage. This is not out of control anger. This was a statement enacted. And then, reasonably so, the reaction is, who gave you the authority to judge what we're doing and to obviously condemn it? And they're even asking, give us a sign, give us some proof that you have the authority to tell us how to run the temple and we're running it wrong.
Greg, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to add one point about the money changers. In Deuteronomy 14, money changers are required to be in the temple. Zechariah 14 is a fulfillment of a day in which no more, and then some verses use the word Canaanite. Another way to translate that is business people. And so the idea of fulfillment of prophecy is not that the money changers were not supposed to be there. I think a lot of people have a tendency to associate incorrectly people who are in the temple with doing bad things. The den of robbers comment isn't isn't suggesting that these people are doing bad things in the temple. They're doing bad things outside of the temple. That's what Jeremiah references, and then they come into the temple as a safe haven. So the Zechariah 14 verse is probably a fulfillment of the prophecy when money changers are no longer required to be a part of the temple.
Right.
But in Deuteronomy 14, it's a law that they be there, that they be in attendance.
Right. No, that's a good point. Yeah, because the people who take exception to what Jesus is doing would say, well, having these animals here is of great service to those who come long distances and obviously couldn't tote an animal all the way from Galilee that was acceptable for sacrifice. The unblemished animal, you might, by the time you get there, it's no longer unblemished, right? So the argument could have been made, yes, these animals are provided, that's a convenience. The changing of money is again a convenience so that you can participate in worship. Yeah, part of their response would be, yeah, what's wrong with what we're doing, right? And I think you're right. It's not that it's just blatantly wrong. I think there's ways in which it has become wrong, and that's Jesus's point. The emphasis has moved from being a house of prayer, which if you read 1 Kings 8, Solomon's dedication of the first temple, he couches it absolutely completely in terms of prayer. It's a place where people come, and he gives all the circumstances under which a person might come to pray. Even the foreigner, the person who's not an Israelite, comes to this temple. He says, you, God, here in heaven, and answer this person's prayer. So it establishes a house of prayer. And I think Jesus's thing is, part of his thing is, it's lost its focus as a house of prayer. And I think you're right, John David. It's not that these things were inherently wrong and introduced, maliciously or something, but they've lost their proper place, and the focus has been lost. And I think that's what Jesus is calling out. I think he would call out the same thing about sacrifice itself, right? Even about tithing. I mean, tithing was commanded as well, but he had some things to say about people who tithe and yet neglected the weightier matters. And so it's to your point, John David, it's a focus on these kinds of details, and missing the big picture is part of what he was critiquing. And I think he's critiquing that about the temple, right? So yeah, thank you. That's helpful context. It's nuanced what he said. But again, the leaders don't perceive him as having flown into a rage, lost his temper, and gone nuts, right? It's not wrath from Jesus.
I don't know, the imagery I get for reading it does still suggest anger to me.
Oh, it's anger, right?
Not, yeah, the loss of control part doesn't
Right.
have to be there. Probably it, but it sounds like, but the anger, you would agree, he was using anger to motivate what he did and how he did it too. I mean, flinging tables. It's theater, but also it seems, I mean, to the point earlier about weeping. I mean, Jesus seemed to be pretty real.
Yeah.
And I think this seemed to really bother him.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Wasn't it by that time too? It's one thing to change the money at an even exchange or no commission. I mean, we all, if we travel, start frustrating them, buying your euros or pounds, paying ridiculous sums of money to the money changers. And then, the animals, to your point, that somewhere I know it, the New Testament was talking about how they're selling blemish as if they're unblemished. So, these animals were not firstborn, pure animals.
Right.
So he's upset with that.
Yeah, and don't take what I'm saying is to say there's no part of anger. That's why I had to start with how do we define wrath? And at least a big component for me is that idea. It's this has gone beyond now, and I'm losing patience and I'm losing control, and now it's an outburst. Like when I suddenly say something and then well, I regret it. Kind of like God looks like in the story of Noah, right? Oops, won't do that again. No more floods. Shouldn't have done that. I mean, he almost looks like he's regretting his choice. I mean, that's the way the story presents it. He regrets his choice. Not going to do that anymore. So I that's why I don't want to start with the Old Testament, because I think often the wrath of God is presented that way, as it's like God loses his patience and then fire comes down and consumes everything. And so that's why I want to start with Jesus, and I want to take this case, and yes, there's anger. We ought to be angry, but what is a godly sort of anger? It never loses control. It never is the kind of ruling emotion, right? I would say that anger is an expression of love. True, righteous anger is an expression of love. And the verse I want to go to is Romans 1:18 to start talking about wrath in terms of what I think is a proper understanding of what we're talking about. And I think this is exactly what Paul's trying to do. I mean, he knows all the Old Testament stories as well, right? He knows what they say. And so here he starts to define where he thinks the wrath appropriately falls, right? So here we are, Romans 1:18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, or of people, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Now, looking carefully at what he's saying, what the wrath of God is revealed becomes apparent, and what's it against? Yeah, ungodliness. If we put it in terms of sin and sinners, it doesn't say it's revealed against sinners, but against their sin, right? So I think what Paul's doing is he's got this backlog just like we all have if we've read the Old Testament, and he's saying, look, what does the wrath of God really turn out to be? It's revealed to be what? Wrath against wickedness. And why is he so angry about wickedness? Because it harms his children. It harms the one who perpetrates it, and it harms the one against whom it is perpetrated. Right? So because of his great love for all humanity, he hates with a deep anger all that hurts us and the way we hurt one another. Now, he doesn't hate us. Kind of like Dave was saying, you don't hate your children because they're making mistakes, but you do want to correct their mistakes because what they're doing is not good. They can't keep doing that. But you don't blame your children for making the same mistakes you make, right? They're like, yeah, I know that's a childish mistake and I need to correct it. And I don't want them doing that. I don't hate my kids for it, right? I think this is where Paul's going to stop. The wrath of God is against what harms us and what we do that harms ourselves and others. And he's angry about that. But that's coming out of love. If he didn't love, well, what would he care if we hurt each other? Why would he be angry about wickedness if he didn't love them? Well, let those people suffer. Let them deal. They created the wickedness. Let them deal with it. Right? That's not what he does, because he loves us too much to just say it doesn't matter that they're hurting each other and being hurt, that they're being corrupted and they're corrupting their own lives. So love necessitates anger, but not an out of control anger, not an anger of revenge. Now, we may have to look at passages if people want to bring them up, but I like this statement. I think it's John Chrysostom, but somebody, I'd have to look it up. But someone who said, do not imagine that you can offend the divine. You know, it's like, come on. It's not like you have personally injured God by your sin. Like now he's lashing back. You hurt me, and I'm gonna, now out of my pain, I'm gonna hurt you back. I remember, I don't remember who was saying, but they were saying the man who closes his eyes against the light does no harm to the light. He's harming himself. Right? If I refuse to see the light, well, the light is not injured. It's not like I've offended God and now God, out of his offense, is going to, be vengeful. You've offended me. That's what we would tend to do. That's what we're projecting on God. Like, you insult me, I'm likely to insult you back. That kind of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You punch me, I feel like I want to punch you back. Because we want to do that. But that's our humanity. That's our fallen. Because we don't know how to do things. But God is not that way. And we're not hurting God. We're only hurting ourselves. And he has mercy and pity upon us for our circumstance. He himself is not offended, is not injured. And so there's no lashing out of injury. Right? We have not lessened the divine by our rejection of it or our waywardness. So what I'm saying, and I think is held up, theologically in a biblical way, is that the anger of God is the expression of his love. It is not the reaction of personal slight, anger, offense, something like that. He's not taking vengeance. Well, he's not taking revenge. There's a theological distinction, at least some people make, between vengeance and revenge. That revenge is like personal. Vengeance is handling a matter, like impersonally. So the vengeance of God is, again, God rooting out the wickedness so as to heal us. The revenge of God would be God taking it personally and then poking us because we poked him, right? God does not do revenge, but God does do vengeance, which I would say is lovingly saying, I'm going to deal with that for your sakes. Okay. So an analogy would be, I hope all of us hate cancer. I hope nobody loves cancer, right? But are you angry or hate people who have cancer? Well, no, of course not. I hate the disease, not the person suffering with the disease. That's the anger of God. God hates the cancer. He does not hate the cancer suffering person. He hates the sin. He does not hate us. We are his beloved children, and he hates the problem. And so with vengeance, he comes to remove the problem. And so heal us, rescue us.
So one of the ways that I understand his wrath is that, and you see it 3 times in Romans further down, is it's a giving yourself up. He's giving you up to people. You had the opportunity, the teaching, you have the ability not to, but at some point he allows you just to suffer the consequences of your own. You see that in the Old Testament too.
Right.
Just gives people up. But I also understand and know that his wrath is not the final word either.
Yeah.
So because you can tend to think that's it, but it's also not the final word in terms of where you can end up and where you can be and how you can be.
Yeah, no, that's well said. Yeah, the final word has to be love, because even this wrath of God is a feature of love. When we see that it's a feature of love, its end is never going to be just bitterness or anger or something like that. I mean, because it's a part of love. The end will always be love. In fact, Bishop Hopko, who's a Eastern Orthodox bishop, in his little catechism, he says that the wrath of God is how sinful people experience his love. Now, what he means, I think, is this. Sometimes when I lovingly discipline my children, they would have said, had you asked them, my father hates me. They were wrong. From their perspective, they thought I'm unfair, I'm awful, I'm taking away privileges. How can I be such an ogre? But the truth was I was loving them and I was putting on some restrictions, some punishment for their own good that they perceived as hatred. I think what Hopko's saying, Bishop Hopko was saying is right. So if I'm determined to harm my neighbors and be selfish, then the love of God will be perceived by me to be, this God is wrathful. Because I don't want anything he's doing, which is trying to heal me of my diseases. And I love my diseases. I don't want to be healed of them. I want to be selfish. I want to be all about me. And here's God's trying to get me to be selfless. And I'm going to fight it. And I'm going to think, you see. So I think that's more of how we're understanding the wrath of God. And I think that's where Paul's starting. It's revealed to be against the wickedness. And I think the reason he chooses the word revealed, because I think, like a lot of things Paul say, it was kind of misunderstood in the past. It was a mystery of what God was doing, but now it's been revealed. Like in the past, we thought it was all about Israel, but guess what's been revealed? It's always been about the whole world, all the nations. You know, in the past, we thought the wrath of God was eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You offend him, he will burn you to a cinder. No, actually, it's been revealed that the wrath of God is against our sinfulness, never to harm us, but only to heal us. And so he's wrathful about what harms us. That's what makes him angry, because of his love.
I think one other part of that that I'm just like keeping in my head is that evil comes from a very evil source, and it is God's enemy. And that enemy is always against us as his people. And so there's a hidden battle going on. And so
Yeah.
God's wrath is constantly against those things that would cause his children harm.
Right.
And so when I side with goodness, and I side with the love of God, I'm siding with that kingdom. He's not going to bring wrath back. But he wants to oppose everything. Because he's for me, he wants to oppose everything that is against me, which is evil itself, sin.
Yeah. And it's, you could put it this way: it is the wrath of God that saves us.
Yes.
Because it's his opposition to the problems of sin and ignorance and corruption that ultimately saves us, that wins us freedom from all those things. If he didn't have wrath against the chains that bind us, how would we ever be set free? Right? So when we start seeing it in those terms, it's not like I fear that God is personally like miffed at me. No, if I'm caught in chains and bound up in things, and he's angry about my imprisonment and he wants to free me. And often that can be misunderstood to be angry with me. But he's not. He dearly loves me, and that's why he wants me to be set free. Okay, so that's where we're starting, but we got further to go. Because I know, because part of the problem with this discussion is this all sounds good, but I got 100 passages that come to my mind that seem to just say this is not true, right? That contradict everything you've just said. How do you do that with this verse and this? So I'm willing to take those on, but I want to take them on. I want to set this first, and we're not even done. But I want to set where I think it's what a good, proper spiritual understanding of this subject is. And then we can start picking up, okay, but what do you do with this, you know? And how do we then read the Old Testament, which is filled with these other stories that don't seem like anyone's getting healed? Seems like they're dead. You know, so that's where we gotta mostly. Not quite. All right. We'll stop there for today. Thank you.